Okay, good morning. We're in Ayin Beis, volume 2, page 1150. I haven't said that in a long time because we've been reviewing 1147 through 1149 quite, I would say, a good few weeks, together with the Tzaddik Daled of the Rebbe Rafidike Rebbe. So now, close to the top of page 1150. And here's what we're discussing. The Rebbe Rashab says, after bringing two interpretations and approaches to explaining the two levels of ayin, the ayin between the Yesha Amiti and Yesha Nivra, between the true reality, the creator, and the created reality, Yesha Nivra, is the ayin be'emtza, the oyer, which breaks into two levels, divides into two levels. Interpretation one, it's both lifniat simsum, both preach simsum, etzem ha'er and ispashtus ha'er. Good. Where the etzem ha'er is more reflective of the ayin amiti of yesh amiti, and the ispashtus ha'er is when that begins to, within the divine consciousness, to have a relationship with another, consideration and all that we've learned. Second interpretation is the ayin. The first ayin is the air before the simsum and overall sevav kalalman, which also after the simsum, sevav, the makifim, retain that, let's call it personality of pre simsum, that's beyond the structure and beyond beyond hierarchy. And the pnimi, in general, the kav, and more specifically the mamala that fills every part of existence, is the ayin of the Yesha Nivra that is, you can say, relates to the Yesha Nivra. It relates to the creation and to each world, to the kelim, and to the creatures and creations in each of the world. And Hashem is the malachim, as we explained, from Akudim through Atzilus to Biyah, B'riyat Shirasi. Now comes the Rebbe Rashab and says, Omnom, he says, at the bottom of page 1149, Hakavona kan hakavona. Here, meaning here in this Hemshech, in these Maimorim, the intention is to a third interpretation, what the Frierdiker Rebbe calls a shita, an approach. And what is that? That the ayin and mamutza, the two levels of yesh, they're both in pnimi. They're both in the immanent and internal energy. And the Rebbe Rashab uses these words. And seemingly, we can say in the most obvious way or ostensible way, how do you explain these two levels in pnimi? Remember, till now, pnimi was the level, the energy that relates to existence. It was the transcendent makif that was beyond that, or even higher, etzem ha'er in the first interpretation. So now he's going to explain that in Pnimi itself, you also have two levels. One that relates more to existence, and one that relates more to the divine energy that's beyond existence. So he began to explain, and that's what we're in the middle of, that how do you explain this? But Pshittus, he says, that the kav which embodies, personifies, embodies mamala. Remember, the kav is a thin, narrow line that energizes creates structure and energizes each part of the structure of post-Simsum existence. So even though it came out, they had Simsum, because it wouldn't be a kav if it was not, nevertheless, it originates, its hamshach comes from Eir and Sof Lifniat Simsum. And moreover, it doesn't say moreover, but he says, Negeya means the kav at its top point, at its top edge, touches and is attached to the Eir Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum. And he quotes the Eitz Chaim that says that after the Tzimtzum there was a kav echad dak, but it came a Eir Hagigol Shalei. So you see clearly it's a kav echad dak, it's one narrow or one thin line. But it comes, Me'era Eagle, as we explained, the eagle is the Eir Ein Sof that remains after the Tzimtzum beyond, before, from prior to the tzimtzum. And he says, Shonugeya, that it says there in Eitz Chaim explicitly, Shonugeya v'dovuk b'erein sof. So now we see the kav has another dimension to it. It's not just mamala that's going to draw and shape and define all of existence, obviously based on the instructions of what Oyer has within it, all going back before the tzimtzum, but it actually is connected to and attached to that divine energy, which of course, not physically speaking, means it retains and is aware of lifnei tzimtzum consciousness. That's bottom line what the kav is. The kav could not be aware, and it is aware. When I say aware, I don't mean necessarily a conscious aware like in a tangible sense. It means it's present within the kav, the higher consciousness of pre tzimtzum. And I explained why. Because that really is what informs the kav. Who's telling the kav? How does the kav know what to shape, which spheres, which worlds? That was all determined. Remember, in the Ratzon, that was before the tzimtzum. That was developing the details. Not the early stages of desire, but the later stages were developing the details, like the artist that is envisioning it all to the point of actually pursuing it, and to the point of allocating resources. Shir atzmei b'kayach. So the kav is originating from those levels, even though in actuality, it has to follow the tzimtzum. There has to be a complete pause in order to create a new paradigm. So everything that happened pre-tzimtzum is there right now, but there's a serious paradigm shift with the tzimtzum, but the kav that comes after the tzimtzum still retains and has and is attached and connected to that dimension of pre-tzimtzum, which is interesting because that was what he said about makif, if you remember. He said that the makifim, even after the tzimtzum, still retain a transcendent element that's beyond existence. Clearly, however, the kav also does, but in a different way, as we shall discuss, just pointing it out. That still, even though the kav is attached to lifnei tzimtzum, it's still not sevav kalam. It's still called the er pnimi. And we'll talk about that. I talked about it a bit yesterday, but I'm going to discuss it more as we go through this. Okay. And then he said the next piece. So the kav is a era dovuk. It's an energy that's attached to its source. When it's boiling ill, I'll just read this again. We read it yesterday, but I'll read it because it'll flow easier. And it was explained earlier. This earlier is most likely back in the chapters that I mentioned, 6 and on, maybe later a little, maybe chapters 10 and on, where he talks about the kav. It may have been mentioned more times in Ayin Beis, but that there for sure it's elaborate. So it was explained earlier that the kav, the amshachas kav, the purpose of it, the inyan, the personality of it, its purpose would be tachlis akav. It doesn't say inyan akav means its identity is what? It's in order to create ma'ilomata, to create a structure, a hierarchical structure of higher and lower. That's what space consists of, higher, ma'ilomata. And how does that work? Because the kav, Erein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, is poshet. It's shapeless and seamless. So how could it create ma'ilomata? It can be higher and lower. Everything is all part of the divine energy, consciousness. The kav, however, is a line. And as a line, number one, it's defined, it's not everywhere. It's a structured line. And the kav itself, therefore, has a higher and lower. But it's specifically, what is higher and lower? Oh, actually, this was not chapter 10. I'll tell you exactly where this was. I think this was around chapter 30, if I recall correctly. Let me just look a second. Yeah. Chapter, be exact. Chapter 33 is where, yeah. It starts a little earlier. Chapter 30 begins the discussion about Nekud the Kav Shetach. Yeah. Chapter 33 talks about how Kav creates. So what does he say there? What defines higher and lower? So when it comes into physical reality, what's higher? Let's say you have a house of a three-story house. Higher and lower is, what's the lowest floor is the ground floor. You walk up the steps or elevator, you go to floor 2, then floor 3. They qualitatively, they're not necessarily higher and lower. They're just physically higher and lower. You could have the most important room or the most important floor in your house could be the first floor. But in Ruchnius, Maila Mata is defined by quality. Maila means, he says there, and he briefly sums it up here, means it's closer to the divine, pure, divine, undiluted energy. Whatever is closer, in a sense, meaning it's more conscious of, with less tzimtzum, is considered higher. So Atzilus is higher than Bria. Why? Not because physically it's above Bria, because spiritually it's completely it's a divine existence. Bria is already a yesh. Akudim is higher than Atzilus. Ach is higher than Akudim. So the Kav, because it's the carrier, so the Kav, on the top end of the Kav, it's attached to Eir Ein Sof. So whatever is closer to that, again, not physically closer, but whatever is more aware and is more in touch with that level, which means less diminishment, that's called Maila. That's what he says. I'll read it inside. Being that at the top edge of the Kav, it touches and is davuk, attached to Eir Ein Sof, ubiksei hatachten, and its lower edge, meaning the bottom of the Kav, which we discussed, doesn't go all the way down. It doesn't reach all the way down to that Eir Ein Sof that surrounds the whole cholol. The Kav only goes a certain distance.
It's not only Negeya, it is Davuk.
Right. It not just touches, it's attached, correct. Al Kain. Therefore, so as the Kav is closer to its source, so something is closer to the source, of course, again, closer is not physical, but more less filtered, less regulated, less diminished. That's called Maila. That's called a higher level. And as it gets distant from the source, meaning the Kav, as it moves downward, away from the top edge, that's what defines a lower state. So it would be, for example, since we're using the example of a teacher and student, the teacher has concealed his brilliance. He's now spoon feeding and in a Kav-like way to his students. Now, among students, there can be different levels of students. Some are very advanced, and they're very close to so-called the mouth of the well, the source, and therefore they are on a higher level. Other students who are slower or beginners, or may even be students of the students, meaning they need more explanation and more time, they would be called mata. Not in a derogatory way. They're simply not yet on that level. They can climb. But if you talk about structure, that's basically what we're talking about here. So therefore, what he's saying here is that the Kav, on one hand, creates Maila Mata, but you see from this that the Kav at the top, at its highest point, it touches and is attached. It'd be a good discussion what was just mentioned by Rav Shlomo, what is the difference in Negeya and Davuk in Aveda, what's the difference? Obviously, Negeya just means touch, Davuk means attached. So you could have, for example, you can be connected technically with your teacher at the source with the teacher's brilliance, but now you have the dvekus to it. But he doesn't explain it here, so I don't want to go into it right now. I'm sure there's ways to explain it. But I would maybe touch upon it after we finish the whole subject. It'd be easier to apply it. But but those two lashonos are used.
Rabbi Jacobson, what does it mean? Why is it that the Kav cannot reach Lemata? It only is connected to it.
It's not that it cannot. God doesn't want it to. God can do anything he wants. If it reaches Lamata all the way, it defeats the purpose of its structure. Then there's no structure again. because then there's no higher and no lower. The lowest part of the kav is just like the top part. They're both touching area and stuff. So of course it could, but it's not. That's not the kavanah. You're not going to have a tachtainim. You're not going to have a hierarchy of a sheder shtalshus if the kav goes all the way down, because then at the end of the day it becomes like a circle. Everything is top. There's no such thing as top and bottom. The whole purpose of the kav is that should be a light that diminishes. If it touches the bottom, then it's connected on all sides to the area and stuff. Anyway, for all practical purposes, this isn't physical. This is conceptual. It basically saying in simple English that the way God made the light that enters into the structure of existence is one that is subject to diminishment, and lower levels emerge from that. That's, in other words, I'm not even using the word it touches the bottom. In simple English, it means that the light has levels to it, and levels therefore define the structure of existence. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, this is where we stopped, and we'll continue now. It's line 6 on page 1150, Aleph Kuf Nun. V'nizbar be'erech, Rebbe Rashab is continuing to cite things he explained earlier. Obviously, now the context is all about the ayin. The end of this, remember, let's not lose sight that he's coming to explain 2 levels of ayin in pnimi. You can already see it emerging from what he's saying, but he's going to spell it out. So he's continuing to bring and cite my earlier parts and sections of Ayin Beis. I already pointed out early chapters were already referred to. Now he's referring to the chapter 33, as I mentioned, and on about Ma'ila Mata. And now he says, and it was explained be'erech at length. Eich de b'chinas Ma'ila Mata dakav. So he's going further. If you look back in those chapter 30s, he's going to say this. How this Ma'ila Mata, this is going even furthermore. This Ma'ila Mata, meaning hierarchy of higher levels and lower levels, qualitatively speaking, of the kav, it's not just a diminished light. In other words, you could say, basically, the reason there's levels is because, like we spoke earlier about the torch, when you're closer to the torch, it's more bright and more warm. You go further, it's essentially a quantitative shift. It's less light, so therefore it's a lower level. Or like the teacher, a student that's very smart and very advanced is right close to the source. As the teacher continues and explains it with more, it reaches downward. But it's not a qualitative shift. It's basically based on diminished light. He's not going to say no. Ki'im, rather, is what we learned at length. It's a distinction, the levels that are distinguished from one another, this diverse structure, or I would say leveled structure, and hierarchical structure, is an etzem muhusam, etzem madregosam rather, is their core level. And he's going to explain what he means by that. Chochmah, he's going to say, Bina is not just diminished Chochmah. The Chochmah shalamayla ma'bina hainu de be'etzem adregosa hilamayla ma'bina. Chochmah that's higher than Bina, which is a perfect example for hierarchy. Chochmah, Bina, Das, so on. He says it's higher than Bina in etzem adregosa. It's fundamental level. Not just Chochmah has more light, Bina has less light. That's why it's called Bina. That's also true. Chochmah has more divine energy, revealed divine energy, and Bina has less. Chochmah is closer to the source, therefore has more bittul and so on. But it's be'etzem adregosa, its core dimensions, core level is different and higher and all than Bina is. In its core level, it's higher than Bina. I'll explain more in a moment. Let me just finish reading. The same thing with Keser that's higher than Chochmah. Let me explain what this means. This is taking back from this is, I think, chapter 34 or 35 back in Ayin Beis, volume 1. The point he's making here, you could say that the Pnimi is really indifferent to the levels. It's like, I'm just giving you an example. You know, remember those those gadgets that you put coins in, quarters, dimes, nickels, pennies, and automatically, because of their size, each one goes in their own section. When you, for example, pour water into a machine like gadget like that, and the water will go to different sections, there's no chiluk be'etzem mohus of the water, whether it goes here or goes here. In other words, if you pour water into a pipe, and the pipe then divides into six different directions, and one is narrow and one is wide, what would you say? It's the same water. The reason it's getting narrower is simply because the channels are narrower. Meaning, as the water flows, it gets more and more diminished, and therefore, the lower levels get less energy. But the water itself is the same. So you could say, technically, that the Pnimi of the Kav, yes, it's subject to Milo Mata. You know why? Because as the light flows, like the light of the sun, and it gets more distant from the source and closer to the recipient, it gets diminished, but it's essentially still the same light. It's really only simply due to the journey and the diminishment of Milo Mata due to, like he says, miyut ha'er, less airs, of course. However, he's saying no, it's much deeper than that. The difference that the Kav creates, the difference between Chochmah and Bina is not just Chochmah has more energy and Bina has less energy. That's true too. But Chochmah is a different personality than Bina. Chochmah has a whole identity that's higher than Bina's identity. As it is, Atzilus is higher than Bria. Not just because Atzilus is closer to the top. Its whole personality is a fundamentally higher level of more awareness of Elokus and so on. So in other words, the Pnimi is actually more Bislapshus. It's not just, okay, as I get diminished, therefore there's hierarchy. The hierarchy is built in, and that's exactly what God wanted. There should be a difference in Chochmah and Bina. Now, however, just for the record, obviously the diminishment of the light is also necessary, because if the light doesn't get diminished, that personality will not be able to emerge. So really the difference between one person and another is not just in how much air you're receiving, there's also a difference in the actual fundamental structure of each entity. And not just in the kalim. Remember, we're not just talking about the arms and the legs, and talking about the nefesh, the eyes and the ears. That the koyach hariyah is different than the koyach hashmiyah. Not just in miut, in ribuy and miut, meaning more or less energy, but also in the fundamental level. Now, why is this relevant here? I'm trying to figure out. Maybe we'll soon see why. Why does he want to emphasize this? He wants to say Milo Mata, so it's in the Etzem Adregosan, and yet the Kav is coming from a place that's higher. Okay, let's see. We don't have to jump the gun. Let's see what he's going to say. Now he's bringing in another theme from earlier. If you remember a few weeks ago, I remember when it was, you could tell many times when the Rebbe Rashab's style, he suddenly at times he goes and begins to bring together many of the central themes of Ayin Beis earlier. I remember a few times that he does that. You can mark what pages, and you suddenly see that he's, like, in a way, summing it all up. So this seems to be an area, because I could identify 3-4 earlier themes that he's addressing and bringing into the picture here, which is very valuable, obviously, because it helps tie the knots together of the central theme of Ayin Beis. You know, very often when I make the whole review, this is the key pages that I look to, because this is where the Rebbe Rashab is making sure that what's connected to what. So it's a very good, essentially, if you're doing any investigative forensic Ayin Beis research, what you do is you want to find these what do we call these signposts, like in the treasure hunt, to be able to really make the connections. So now he's going to bring another theme, which is actually from volume 2. And then he's going to bring it all back together to explain how the Kav has both ayins within it. That's where we're headed now. So far, again, he's talked about, he's explaining b'pshitus, that's the words of the Rebbe Rashab, the two levels of Ayin, by saying that the Kav on one hand comes after the Tzimtzum, on the other hand, it's connected and attached. It's touches and is attached to the Lifnei Tzimtzum, areas of Lifnei Tzimtzum. That indeed is what makes it the hierarchy, because that which is more closer to that edge on top is higher and that would lower. And now we explained that higher and lower is also in quality. It's also the actual levels are higher and lower, not just diminished or abundant light and energy. Now the next thing, and here he said in his Bar Ba'erech at length. Okay. V'nizbar le'il, here goes another nizbar le'il. That's what I'm telling you. You can see from all these nizbar le'ils. And now he tells us where this is. Dibra maskil v'hi ha'onon v'acheshech v'yoyer. This is a Pesach Maimer in Ayin Hey. This is where he began asking the question, if you remember, how can post-symptom reality, how can post-symptom consciousness connect with pre-symptom reality, or post-symptom reality with pre-symptom consciousness, however you want to say it. That was when he began the discussion in Maimer of Pesach Ayin Hey. If you want the page number, I can give it to you right now. Pesach Ayin Hey began this new subject. Basically, what we're in the middle of now is all explaining that began then in the Pesach Maimorim. Yeah, page Tuf Kufam 934. We're now in 1150. So what do we learn there? Nizbar le'il was explained earlier. Shezeu al yedei tzimtzum. How does the kav become a force that creates these structures? Remember, before the tzimtzum, there's no structure. Ein sof mamala kol hametzias pashut. Ein sof mamala kol hametzias pashut. It's shapeless. So think of a bleak wool, an infinite quilt or field of energy. How will that suddenly turn into a structure? Yes, in that field of energy, God envisions and desires and all the levels, but it's all within God's infinite energy that he's envisioning it all. How does it actually become a structure, like a structure of existence as we know it? And when I say structure, I mean all the way from Ak through Akudim, Atzilus, Bria, Sira, Sia, all the way down to here. It's a structured existence. So to say Kol Yachol, God can do anything, we already determined and explained, that's not the way he wanted to do it. Of course he can do anything. He doesn't need to explain how from infinite becomes finite, or from shapelessness comes shape. But he wanted us to understand it, and he wanted us to be able to retrace the steps. I say this again and again because it's an unspoken given, an axiom that needs to be always remembered whenever Chassidus is learned. It very rarely says it. In few Maimarim, the Rabbeim say it, but it's usually something that's expected that we know before we even get here. Because without that, all this becomes like, why do we need all this? As I explained numerous times. So the question now is, so how do you explain how from without no madregas suddenly become madregas? We explained that the kav, we understand the process, meaning the functionality of the kav is now a narrow line, a thin line. It is made up of higher and lower, that which touches Ein Sof and attached to it, that which is lower and is not attached, so diminishes, and therefore, but that's all explains the how, meaning the actual way that we have the process of that. But how, actually, that all explains the process, but we don't understand where did this become? How did it jump to a kav? So he says that's what we learned in the Vayhi Ha'onon. Shezeu Eidei Tzimtzum. That this whole thing began due to the tzimtzum. If there was no tzimtzum, there'd be no kav. Obviously, if there's no kav, there's no ma'ilomata. So the tzimtzum does not create hierarchy, but it creates the possibility for a kav to come now and create a hierarchy and a structure. Back to the example. The teacher, in his flow now to his students, that's his kav, He's speaking to different students, different levels. But all that would not have happened if he didn't have a tzimtzum. If his brilliance filled his whole being and he was completely absorbed in his learning and he never was mitzamtzim himself, he never concealed all that brilliance, he didn't pause and didn't stop, there'd be no kav, and there'd be no space for the students, there'd be no kav to transmit to them. So basically the dynamics is really very eloquent. The tzimtzum creates the space because it puts aside the bligvul, that infinite, what I said, shapeless the field of energy. It conceals it, only from the recipients, obviously. It's still there in the teacher's mind, but it creates now that space. Now a kav can enter, a kav which is impacted by this tzimtzum because it follows the tzimtzum and can create hierarchy and structure. So the kav is the implementer, and the tzimtzum is, you could say, it creates the space, the possibility for it all. Okay, so he says, so we learned earlier in Vahi Anan that this is through the tzimtzum. What's through the tzimtzum? This ability, he says, so what do we learn there? He learned one of the effects. You remember, if you may recall, we learned different effects that tzimtzum has. Because he spoke about to transform the tzimtzum, you have to first know its impact. What did it accomplish? So what did the tzimtzum do? One of the things it did, it caused the air to be shalei b'hadraga. Let me spell in simple English. It means like this: the teacher concealed his brilliance and paused. He became quiet. He just to visualize it. He's sitting and learning with full intensity. Think of the Rebbe in his room, learning with all his brilliance, no filters, no regulation, no nothing. Everything is the way on his level. He doesn't have to adjust. He's not even preparing to teach to anyone or to speak. This brilliant teacher. If it remains there, nothing's going to happen. He's going to stay there. There will be no room for others to enter, to have space. I don't mean physically. It's just not, that's what he's on a level that's beyond all the students. So if he stays there, so what does he need to do? He needs to pause. He has to stop that state. Meaning, okay, I'm going to stop learning at my level. I'm going to now be quiet, prepare myself, and now I'm going to begin to prepare my farbrengen or my discussion or my class shir for the students. So the pause is what he calls shalei b'hadraga. B'hadraga would mean that, in his own level of bligvul or eir ein sof, he moves level to level within himself. It's not really levels, but you can say it's b'hadraga. Shalei b'hadraga means a quantum leap. That's literally what it means. It means a leap. Shalei b'hadraga. Hadraga would be after the tzimtzum. We say it's b'hadraga. Shtalshlus, chachma, bina, das, atzilus, bria, yitzir asiyah. That's hadraga. Sometimes there's also a leap there. If you remember the parsa, the curtain or the veil or the partition is considered also a leap between atzilus and bria. But in general, once after the tzimtzum, you never have that quite quantum leap. You may have learned the Chassidus, it says that tzimtzumim later are b'derech miyut. The tzimtzum arishon is b'derech siluk. What's the difference between miyut and siluk? Miyut means diminished. In other words, you're teaching and you see the need to diminish it, so you give a mashal, an example, you explain it more, you bring it down in simpler words, whatever it may be. Siluk literally means removed. But we know that it's not tzimtzum k'pshutei, so it's not actual removal, but it means a quantum leap. It's a paradigm shift. Let me explain the paradigm shift, and it'll be a little easier. The famous story with the chassid who was having this argument with a non-chassid, and they talk about God. Finally, they didn't get anywhere. The chassid has his way of looking at it, the other one has his way. Finally, the chassid says to him, all frustrated and exhausted from this argument, he says, I envy you. The chassid says to Nachal, why? Because you think about God all day. I have to be honest, I think about myself all day. And they part ways. So, of course, this Lamdan, this Talmid Chacham, is very, very flattered. And he gave him a lot of self-worth that this big chassid acknowledges that he thinks about God and the chassid thinks about himself. Until he's enlightened either by himself over the years or someone else, however the story goes, and says, no, you fool. He actually insulted you in a nice way. He thinks, you think about God all day because you know you exist. So you don't have to think about yourself. It's a given. You never think twice. But your question is, does God exist? So you think about God. Maybe he exists, maybe he doesn't exist. How does he exist? Why all that? The chassid by him, melakus bepshittus. God is a given. He doesn't have to think about it. His question that he ponders on all day, do I exist? Am I real? Am I not real? Why am I here? Who put me here? What's my purpose? So in other words, in the Chassidish language, before the tzimtzum, it's elikus bepshittus. Elikus is a given. As I said, divine consciousness, that's all there is. There's no room for anything else. But in that, the Eibishter wants to have an existence. So he envisions what it's like. But it's a novelty. It's a novel thing. So he envisions, as we learned. He considers, he deliberates, he determines, then the details, and then he allocates resources, all within himself. But that's all a novelty. On its own, it ain't sof elikus. There's nothing else. Ein eid milvade. The tzimtzum creates the shift. I like to always put it this way: it turns the glove inside out. Till now, the hand was the only thing that existed, and then you think about the glove. After the tzimtzum, the Eibishter concealed that divine consciousness. So now it's elamas bepshittus. Now existence is the given. And elikus, meaning ein sof lifnei tzimtzum, that's something we need to work toward. So everything is turned inside out. Up before the tzimtzum, you can say everything is inner. And it's considering having a relationship with another. After the tzimtzum, the other is now becoming dominant. And it is looking to find what put me here. So basically, if you really want to discuss Das Elyon and Das Tachten, which we'll be discussing, or the ayin of each, the ayin of the Yesh Amiti is reflecting perspective one. Everything is elikus. Ayin of the Yesh Anivra is there's existence. And from there, you work your way toward elikus. So what do you see? This is a shaloi b'hadraga. That's what the tzimtzum, if you don't take, without the Arizal being mechadash, the inyan of tzimtzum, there's a big theological dilemma of, is there a connection between asmus and existence? The tzimtzum actually resolves the issue, because the tzimtzum explains in a logical way how we can understand that the divine gets concealed and allows for another to emerge. Remember, it doesn't emerge immediately. Let's be honest. The highest levels of the kav is not exactly elamas bepshittus. It's still very much aware of elikus. However, you already have now an entity, the beginning of another, so to speak. So the story I told is really much more fitting in this world. In this world, completely we feel the world exists and God is the thing we seek. Up there, even after the tzimtzum, is still pretty divine. So I just want to qualify what I'm saying. But relative to pre-tzimtzum is absolutely divine. There's no such thing even of a semblance of another entity. So he says, so therefore we learn back in the Maimonim Vahi Onan, the Pesach Maimonim of Ayin, that this is through the tzimtzum, because through the Ayadesha Bashalei Ba'adraga, that's what the tzimtzum did. It made a radical leap, a quantum leap, a shift. That is not hadraga. It's a change of consciousness. Now suddenly consciousness has changed. There's another consciousness besides divine consciousness. Nasa hischalkus ba'er. And that causes that the oir should now have capacity, have distinction, levels. Before the tzimtzum, it's all ened milvade. Even if we say that the ened milvade, the Ein Seif, has in it within itself dimensions, it's still not real hischalkus. Let's be honest. When God is considering or deliberating or determining or allocating or the details, it's all within a lakus. Lifnei tzimtzum, we said eira kol batzmusei. You can't call it. There's no structure. There's no hierarchy. Yes, there's a hierarchy conceptually. You can say this level, that level. It's the tzimtzum that activates a shift. then now you can speak about his chalkus. So without the tzimtzum, the Eir, with all the levels we learned, would remain all divine Atzmis Dika levels. It would be like Atzmus saying, here I want a detail, here I don't want a detail. It's all part of Eir Ein Sof Lifnei HaTzimtzum. Now, the tzimtzum creates the space where the Eir now is subject, the Hischalkus emerges. That's what we learned. So the Eir, there's Hischalkus in the Eir, which of course leaves, that's what creates the possibility for the Kav. For the Kav to become, because the Kav is a Hischalkus in Eir. The Kav clearly is not shapeless and completely undefined. The Kav absolutely has structure, higher and lower. It's closer to the top and lower and so on. So bottom line is, he explained now the dynamics and citing earlier Maimorim to help us understand it all. Now he's going to go back to what we're talking about. But before I continue, anybody wants to ask something about this particular piece that I just discussed, or should I continue?
I just want to ask you something. That you make a big paradigm shift to go from before the symptoms to after the symptoms. If somebody's crawling up and going up the ladder, how does he make a paradigm shift? The Eibush pushes them up, or is it a gift at that point? What happens then?
No. What happens is, because within the tzimtzum, if you remember, lies the kavanah of Gilui. Remember? The purpose of day and night together, this is all part of this discussion. The tzimtzum itself, number one, contains the purpose of Gilui. Tzimtzum is not a airtight black hole. The tzimtzum is ostensibly it's a concealment, but its purpose is to allow the student or allow the recipient space. But the tzimtzum itself is very fully aware that its purpose is ultimately to reveal, not to conceal. That's number one. Number two, the kav is drawing down energy b'lifnei tzimtzum. We have many, many resources and tools given to us after the tzimtzum to be able to climb back without miracles. If you remember, that was the whole point in the Maimerim there, Pesach and Shavuos. He was asking, how do we bypass the tzimtzum? The tzimtzum seems to be, as you just, it seems to be like a glass ceiling, because all of existence is predicated upon it. That's the whole discussion that we're learning now. So he said, we can't say we're bypassing it. We can't say we're surrendering to it. We can't say we're overriding it. Even though Matan Torah, Kriyas Yamsuf, there are moments that God did that, we have to transform it. And that's the whole point, that tzimtzum can be transformed, but that requires the avodah of Adam. Our work of taking the tzimtzum in our lives, which means right now we have the possibility to be selfish, God forbid, to think about ourselves, and maybe from time to time, as I said, a novelty, a lakus, bischachus, we think about God, we do him a favor from time to time. However, if you reverse that and you become a person who's who's conscious of the divine all the time, Shavisi Hashem lenegdi samid. And what do you do with your animal soul? The animal soul is the tzimtzum within you. He said this clearly earlier. You work on it. You don't let the animal soul control you. This work you're doing, you are transforming the tzimtzum in a microcosm within yourself, which prepares you to climb. So when you get back to that place where the paradigm shift happened that you're asking, you're well prepared, you're well armed. First of all, you're armed with the tools that come from before the tzimtzum. You were created in the divine image. The kav is connected to before the tzimtzum. And there's other things, Matan Torah, Kriyas Yamsuf, the Ovis. We have plenty of resources in our arsenal that help us. But Aveda is the key. At the end of the day, it's the bittul of a person. That when you have the proper bittul allows you to pierce through the tzimtzum all the way back to pre. But you can't jump in a second. Again, I told you, if you try to do this immediately, it won't work. You have to climb step by step. You can't daven Shemoneh Esrei before you said Meida'ani, and before you say the brachas, and before Psukei D'Zimra. Why? Because you can't jump into Atzilas before you go through Asiya, Yitzira, Bria. That's how it works. Time to time, we have a gift. You have a Yom Kippur, you have a special day, you have a special Gilui. That's meant to give us a jump start. But at the end of the day, it's the Aveda that you internalize a lakus, I'm a Malik Kalalman. Mamalik Kalam, remember, is attached to Sevav Kalalman, and Sevav Kalalman is attached to Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, all the way to the highest levels. You work with that internally, then you come to a point where the Tzimtzum can be transformed. And therefore, it's not just some miracle at that point. It was hard work. Going back to the student, when you learn ABC, Aleph Beis, you know a little, then you learn more and more. And then you master to the point you become like the teacher's mind and even surpass your teacher. That is what means, that's exactly in Samach Vav, that's the example he uses, how we can access Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum. We ultimately become like the teacher as he was in his brilliance before the Tzimtzum. But you have to go through the levels. And those levels have embedded in them, sometimes more concealed than others, all kinds of juicy goodies that help you, remind you about Lifnei Tzimtzum existence. Remember, learning Chassidus about Lifnei Tzimtzum also helps, because at least we know that there's these levels. That's the general answer to that.
It did, but then I almost think that it's not a good phrase to say quantum leap. When the Abbot says have to make a quantum leap,
it's absolutely a quantum leap. It's even more than a quantum leap.
Our eyes a quantum leap. It's like it's not in the Abbot's eyes, because he can go down.
We all know that Tzimtzum does not affect the Abbot.
But it goes down.
That's not the question. Of course, the Tzimtzum doesn't affect the teacher. It only affects the recipients. From our point of view, it's a complete quantum leap, because from divine consciousness, you've now moved to existing consciousness.
I got it.
The Tzimtzum does not impact God or godly energy. That we know.
Just that it's quantum leap for our
But it's not an imaginary thing. It's a real quantum leap. It's a new identity. It ultimately created a Hitler that was able to kill 6 million Jews. It's not a joke. It's not some little game. It's a tremendous concealment that the divine also wants. And there's levels of the divine. We say the Shekhinah is in Golus. Why do we say the Shekhinah is in Golus? Because the divine, lower levels of the divine, are also subject to this Tzimtzum. Obviously, from the point of view of Atzmus, and definitely, and also levels of higher levels of Ur. As I said, the deepest levels are, Helam can only affect a Gilui. There are levels in Atzmus, the levels that are higher than Gilui are not affected by the Tzimtzum, but neither do we have a relationship with them. They are beyond the quantum leap. So knowing that their symptom doesn't affect them doesn't help us, because at the end of the day, they are beyond the quantum leap. They don't even need a quantum leap. They're so beyond us. Mitzvah is built in Mitzvah Nimtzah, doesn't need a tzimtzum. It's a completely different reality altogether. And yet, because the tzimtzum doesn't impact, we're able to access it. It's a whole complicated system here. But the tzimtzum should not be diminished as being, oh, it's only from our point of view. That's not the way I would explain it. All of it, everything that we know is based on it. Everything. And God wants, this is the Nesava Dira B'Tachtenim. It's not a game. The Dir B'Tachtenim, real Tachtenim, the Tzimtzum Nikra Kalim, the Rebbe explains that Tzimtzum is a real Metzias, it's not an illusion. That's why Torah Mitzvahs matters. It's not just, oh, you know what, it's a Lakus anyway, and the game is whether you can reveal it or not. No, it's a big, we transform existence. It's a real transformation. It's Yesh Ma'ayin, remember. And therefore, when we transform the Yesh to Ayin, it's an equal quantum leap, like the Ayin created the Yesh. So even though we can't say that Tzimtzum affects those levels, but God is very concerned with the post-Tzimtzum reality, because that's his whole kavanah. He wouldn't do all of this. Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum would never exist if there was no intention to create the reality that's post-Tzimtzum. God doesn't need Ein Sof. What does he need it for? It's only there to ultimately allow us to be able to reach up. It's there, basically, we learned this also, that the kavanah of Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, the Gilui, the Helam, B'Pnimius, it has within it, embedded within it, the intention to create a Tzimtzum. The question whether the Tzimtzum actually affects it or not that's already a question of levels. But that there should be a Tzimtzum, yes, even Etzem Ha'er knows that there's going to be a Tzimtzum. It just doesn't impact Etzem Ha'er, but it knows it's going to be and knows how important it is.
The Etzem Oyer is the level for the Amshocha that is coming from that. And this is how it's coming to Tzimtzum eventually. The Etzem Oyer himself is not
qualify what that
Amshocha.
means exactly. That needs to be qualified. Not exactly. I wouldn't put it quite that way, but ultimately, yeah, the levels of Eir. Remember, he said Etzem Eir is not even subject to miyut. To miyut. He said clearly, only Hispashtus Eir is subject to diminishment. In other words, only in Hispashtus Eir will the Tzimtzum have an impact. But yes, the kavana of Tzimtzum is definitely there in the highest levels. Look, when you say Tzimtzum, it's ultimately an atzmus. It's keich shalei lahoyer. The power. So it's still yechelis ha'atzmus. Tzimtzum is also yechelis ha'atzmus. Didn't happen on its own. It's yechelis ha'atzmus to conceal, and there's yechelis ha'atzmus to reveal. And obviously, in atzmus, both of them are equal. It's one yechelis, God's capacity. When it starts becoming structured, that's when we can start relating to it. Because in atzmus, as I said, we won't be able to relate to atzmus, because atzmus, everything is everything and everything is nothing. There's altogether nothing to define. But atzmus wanted that we should have some relationship in different levels. That's why you need everything. You need etzem and nefesh. Let me ask you a question. How do you explain this? The kukuriku of the child went into shul on Rosh Hashanah. He heard everybody crying and the shefer, and he went and cried kukuriku. And that pierced all the heavens and abolished the decree, etc. Basically, the mila of the etzem, of the pshitus of a simple child. And then we talk about the qualities of Moshe Rabbeinu and Talmidei Chachamim and Tzaddikim and the Rabbeim and all the Nesiim throughout the generations and Mashiach. And here we're talking about every simple child has it. And suddenly we're talking about the qualities of all these great people. In a way, what Kairach asked, Madua Tisnasu. Everybody's holy. So why are we suddenly talking about Moshe Rabbeinu? There's no one like Moshe. Ponim b'ponim dibarim Hashem. He spoke God face to face, etc., etc. So you could say in a simple level, one is Giluyim and one is Etzem. Etzem is everywhere. Atzmus is everywhere. As a matter of fact, sometimes Giluyim, like the Mashal with the Baal Shem Tov, Tfilah La'ani, can block. For a person who's a big scholar and is a brilliant person, instead of experiencing the etzem of Elikus, he'll experience the majesty of the divine. Meaning God's Giluyim, these great Giluyim, and they can be very distracting. Like the Rebbe brings the story with the Upter and the Baditchever, that they made a condition that when they go up Lamaila, Mashiach didn't come, they're not going to go into Gan Eden until Mashiach comes. So first the Abtar, I think, was the Abtar. I'm not sure who it was. Who was the second one? One of the tzaddikim. He was nostalgic first, and they were waiting below, and nothing. Mashiach didn't come. So the Baditchever said, the Papashtas, what happened was, once he saw Gan Eden, it was too powerful for him to say, I'm not going in. Teire, kolayem kule, gili zivashchina, nenim zivashchina. The Baditchever said, I am going to be of action and I will not go into Gan Eden no matter how enticing it is. The Baditchever was nostalgic and Mashiach also didn't come. So they said, the Rabbeim said, whoever said, the Rebbe told us that Bapashas, what happened was the Baditchever, of course, made a promise. So he lived up to it. So he didn't go into Gan Eden, but what they did was a trick. They extended Gan Eden, it should go beneath him. So now suddenly they brought Gan Eden to him. So that already he could not resist. Not to go in, he was able to control himself, but to go out, that he couldn't do. That's the story. The Rebbe told this in the Mems, and then actually said, or late Mems, when was it? You know, the Rebbe said something very powerful. I mean, it's a nice story, Bechlal, but it's also relevant here. The Rebbe said that now, what's the eight? So what should we do now? Whoever's going to go up Lamaila is going to be seduced by Gan Eden, and the Giluyim are very powerful. And we're not talking about powerful Chaz v'Shalom in a negative way. It's Elikus. You see Elikus. and you're completely seduced and you forget about Mashiach, you forget about Atzmus and so on. So the Rebbe said this time we should make a neder berabim. When you make a neder is a vow. So when you make a vow, you could always be matir the vow. You could take a vow and absolve it. Chochem is matir neder. But if you make a vow berabim, if you and I and 1,000 other people say, we vow together that we will not go into Gan Eden unless Mashiach comes, even if you want to break the vow, you can't, because there's another 999 people that are part of your vow. You can't break the vow for them. That's what the Rebbe said. We should make a vow of neder berabim. Now, I'm not sure what that resulted yet, but maybe it'll ultimately result Mashiach, I'm sure, very soon. But the point I want to make is that Giluyim are very, very enticing. And that's why sometimes they block us from accessing the Etzem. That's why it was a big thing when the Alter Rebbe said, Mili b'shamayim v'im chalei chafatzti. I don't want your Gan Eden and Elam Haba, Gan Eden Atach, Gan Eden El, Elam Haba. I want you alone. Anonesim al atzmus. Because it's a big thing for a person who appreciates Elokus. For a simple person, it's no big thing. He doesn't know what Gan Eden is, doesn't know what Elam Haba is. But someone who does, it's not a simple process to just. My point I'm making here is that there's two tracks. We all have Etzem and Neshama. That's what comes. It's Tzuma Sheyeh Mechaper. Yom Kippur touches Yechida. It's Yechida. But that's not a regular Aveda to be in Kisidron. That's not a daily Aveda. That's from one it's a year. The Eibishter gives that jolt, the ability to pierce all the heavens, break through all the doors, no matter what. Ne'ilah, Yechida, the Mesiras Nefesh. But we don't live on the level of Mesiras Nefesh. We need to now bring that Yechida into our Keiches. So the truth is that we're constantly dealing with Etzem and Giluyim. Giluyim are subject to Helam. The Kukuriku, no Tzimtzum can conceal Etzem. That's why every Jew has, as he says in Tanya, Kal Shebekalim even. Even the most lenient Jew who be Giluyim doesn't seem like has any Giluyim, he still has an atzmizdik connection. It's like a father and a child, a parent and a child. Doesn't matter how the child behaves, doesn't matter how the parent behaves. They will never be disconnected. And Shayim, he brings from the Alter Rebbe. Aid nishta vil, nishta ken sein agedism von Elokus. Not he could and not he wants to be agedis, an etzem level. But then there's a whole level of giluyim. You can't just say we're going to live and connect to Atzmus. Atzmus wanted it to be internalized, that we should experience it through our Aveda. Because if you go with this approach, we don't need to educate ourselves. If you go with Keirach's approach, you don't need a Moshe Rabbeinu, you don't need Aaron, you don't need teachers, you don't need Torah, you don't need anything. You don't need Ava and Yira. Be'etzim. So what? But that's not the kavanah. The kavanah is adira betachtenim, begilui. That God should feel present here, begilui, not be'etzem. Be'etzem, he doesn't need the whole thing. Be'etzem, the tzimtzum didn't have an effect. And our Aveda, you could say, the etzem is always intact. And yet, at the same time, in a mysterious way, in the Sava Kadosh Baruch Hu, even the etzem desires this. Not with seichel. There's something about this transformation that we do through our Aveda that even Atzmus, that's the driving force. We will never understand why, because there is no why. It's beyond why. So to say all this is happening on lower levels, no. It's all, I don't want to say impacting, but it's all desired by Atzmus. But that desire includes all the levels of Giluyim and Helam and getting out of Golus. You know, I've cited the Sichim Vayigash Chelik Hey, L'kutei Sichos a number of times, where the Rebbe asks, is Mashiach and Geula only for us or also for God? Because from God's point of view, he doesn't mind if there's a Helam. Elokus is everywhere, no matter what. Atzmus is so you could say Mashiach and Geula is only for us. It's like throwing us a candy to reward us for our Aveda. And the Rebbe says there, big chiddush. No, Atzmus is not complete unless it's also begili. So even from Atzmus' point of view, it also has to come out in a manifest form. And that's where we have the whole hierarchy and all the levels that we're talking about to transform the Helam. And then there comes a point.
Vayigash Chelek Hey.
Vayigash
Chelek Hey.
The second Sichia. It's about Yofa Sha'achas B'tshuva Maisim Tevim. It's a very, you say this, a very fundamental Sicha. If you want to read it in English, I cite part of it in the chapter on God and unity, and unity in the chapter in Torah Meaningful Life. But let me just say this as a concluding point. At the end of the day, you want etzem and giluyim. That's why you have etzem ha'oyer that reflects atzmus. Because if the interface is going to be complete, you need to have the giluyim, because that's the only way we can travel. And you ultimately want the giluyim to meet etzem, and then you come to a place where etzem and giluyim join. As I said the other day, the hierarchy joins that which is beyond. Space joins beyond space. And that's only possible with koyach ha'atzmus. So even though I keep saying everything has to be understandable, so we explain everything till the point where, yes, there comes a point where we'll not be able to explain, but we can experience where atzmus meets etzem ha'oyer, and through the other bittul that we have, we can even experience God's face, because we are suspended and we have surrendered our own sense of self, that you're seeing it by not looking, as we've discussed a number of times. But you can't get there if you don't go through all the levels. There's simply no shortcuts. That's the bottom line. So it's a constant process of etzem and giluyim. Here we're obviously talking about how existence. Remember, existence is just as important as atzmus here, because atzmus wants existence, and existence is defined by structure. So the tzimtzum helps us understand the space created for another consciousness where there is chalkus ha'er, that air can start being subject to some type of distinction. The kav is the implementer of that by actually creating that structure. Let's stop here. The conclusion is going to be now, going to explain how the kav has both levels of ayin based on what we just learned. So I did somewhat of a more overview, not just of what we're learning now, just to give the whole picture some semblance of understanding. I hope it was helpful.
Thank you. Good Shabbos. Good Shabbos.
Good Shabbos. We'll stop here in the middle of page 1150, or a third down.